Evening, everyone. It's great to be with all of you and appreciate your leadership and activism, as was just evident in the last couple of minutes on all the issues that you're involved in. I've had the chance, I think, to meet many of you over the years during my time when I served on the Board of Supervisors as board president, and then over the past 7 years as the East Side representative to the California State Legislature. I think folks probably know I was appointed to this new role, replacing the 20-year veteran Dennis Herrera about 5 months ago when he went off to head up the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission. Also just want to appreciate your neighborhood activism. I think some of you know I got my start in community work many years ago as as an activist, and then the chair of Lower Polk Neighbors and one of the founders of Middle Polk Neighborhood Association. And throughout my time as an elected official, I've always prioritize making sure that I am in close touch with neighborhood groups and neighborhood leaders, because you are obviously on the ground. You see issues at a very grassroots level, and what you and your associations do is really help to focus the work of those of us who are your elected officials. So appreciate that. When I was a District 3 supervisor, I would have regular meetings with the 10 or so neighborhood associations in my district. As a state legislator, I would regularly meet with, there are probably 4 dozen or so neighborhood associations on the East Side. And as your city attorney, I very much want to continue those conversations and dialogues. This is probably the 10th or 11th presentation that I've done in my first couple months with neighborhood associations, and happy to go anywhere and everywhere to talk about the issues that we grapple with in the city attorney's office. Since I've taken office, there have been lots of questions and frankly a lot of confusion about what our office does. And so we have put together a short, probably 10-minute PowerPoint presentation that lays out what we do in particular in relationship with neighborhood groups. And then I'm happy to open it up to whatever folks want to talk about. So Michelle, why don't we go to the first slide? And let me just also introduce Michelle Kong is my community outreach person. And so if those of you who are leaders with any neighborhood groups want us to come and either do this presentation again or chat about anything else, please reach out to her. And Peter Keith is the head of our code enforcement team, which probably works most closely with our neighborhood community members. And we will have probably about half this presentation relevant to the work of his legal deputies. So what we'll do in the next 10 minutes, a little bit about who we are, what we do, and how we can work together to improve our city. Next slide. So the city attorney's office, established under the city charter. One thing I always need to emphasize is we practice civil law. Criminal law, as I think many of you know, is under the purview of our district attorney, Chiu Boudin. But we handle all civil matters. We represent the city and county of San Francisco, and I'll explain a little bit of what that means. But what it doesn't mean is we don't represent individual members of the public, although we do bring lawsuits on behalf of the public. And there are basically 3 categories of things that we do. We provide advice and counsel to 100+ clients, and I'll explain that in a moment. We defend the city against thousands of lawsuits brought against San Francisco every year. And then we can bring affirmative litigation on behalf of San Francisco and the people of the state of California. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means. We are an independent office. So unlike city attorneys in many other jurisdictions in California, I am one of 11 elected city attorneys. I'm on the June ballot this year. As opposed to being appointed by, say, a city council or a mayor or a chief administrative officer. And the city attorney's office in our city charter is part of our system of checks and balances in our local government. And I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. Next slide. So who's in our office? We have about 300 legal professionals. It's about 2/3 lawyers, and then a lot of legal staff, investigators, and others that help us do our jobs. As I mentioned, we represent the city and county of San Francisco. And what that means is, first and foremost, we are the general counsels to over 100 city departments, boards, and commissions, or as former Luis former city attorney Luis Rennie used to say, from A to Z, the airport to the zoo. So any function of government, police and fire, muni, the airport, the port, rec and park, library, fine arts, I could go on and on. You are very familiar with all the acronyms. We also provide counsel to most of the elected officials in the city. So that includes the mayor, that includes every member of the Board of Supervisors, that includes providing civil advice to each of the citywide electeds in town. We have confidential attorney-client privilege relationships with them. So unless they have publicly talked about something they're working on, I am not allowed to share our privileged conversations with them individually unless they allow us to do so. Next slide. So of the three categories of work that three major categories. So one portion is we are general counsel to all of these agencies and elected officials. What that means is we are providing objective, consistent advice to all of them. Or another way of putting it, you may wonder if, let's say the mayor and the Board of Supervisors do not agree on a topic, and we are asked for our legal perspective. If we are asked the same question by any number of policymaking bodies or officials, we provide the same answer, although in the attorney-client privilege relationship that we have. We also draft and negotiate all contracts as to form to make sure that they are on their face legal. We also draft and approve as to form every ordinance that is discussed and debated by the Board of Supervisors and the mayor. We also provide written legal advice on a whole variety of topics. The most famous one today, we put out a memo on what's happening to the redistricting process moving on, given the challenges and controversies around the redistricting task force. A lot of our advice is confidential, but some of our advice is public and available on our city attorney website. Next slide. So we represent the city in defending over 4,000 claims and lawsuits brought each year against the city. This is everything from, say, a slip and fall on city property, to a muni bus accident, to a tree falling on someone in a rec and park property, to a labor dispute, to someone suing over a city ordinance, tax issues, etc. And we represent the city in every form you can imagine. So from administrative hearings to the state and federal level, trial, appellate, Supreme Court. Just a few weeks ago, we were at the United States Supreme Court defending a policy against the Trump administration that had carried on after Trump left office. A few weeks before that, we won a major victory at the California Supreme Court, protecting over $100 million of resources for our local schools. So we're involved in a lot of different proceedings. Next week, we're going to be in federal court on a major lawsuit suing the opioid industry, so on and so forth. Next slide. And then I mentioned that we can bring lawsuits on behalf of the city when the city's interests have been harmed. We are probably most world famous for the work that Dennis Herrera did around marriage equality. We brought the litigation to make sure that City College wasn't forced to be closed. We had literally dozens of matters against the Trump administration. We can also bring lawsuits on behalf of the people of the state of California when our interests are harmed. We typically do this using the California Unfair Competition Law, which we can bring against companies and businesses and industries for practices that are unlawful, unfair, or fraudulent. A few examples of these are lawsuits that we brought against the lead paint industry on behalf of consumers, against payday lenders, against gun manufacturers, against Recology. We are in the middle of litigation against Uber and Lyft for their ongoing activities that we believe violate law. A couple months ago, we settled the largest settlement in the history of our city's Office of Labor Standards Enforcement against DoorDash. At the moment, we also have a major lawsuit against the largest fossil fuel companies in the country for the billions of dollars of expenses that they are costing San Francisco with regards to sea level rise. Next slide. So I'll also mention we have a whole team of investigators that assist us in gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and preparing us for legal cases. as well as this team is involved in public integrity work. I'm sure everyone on this call is very familiar with the work that's been done by this unit over the last couple of years. It is the work of the city attorney's office that led to the FBI arresting, and then the U.S. attorney's office bringing charges against, from my perspective, way too many City Hall insiders. At this point, I think we've had 5 City Hall department heads in the last couple of years that have stepped down amidst allegations of unethical, unlawful, and corrupt behavior, including just a couple of weeks ago, the head of the Department of the Environment, based on recent work within our public integrity unit. We work very closely with Ben Rosenfield and the Controller's whistleblower program to really root out wasteful practices, misuse of city funds, improper activities. Next slide. Now, I want to take a couple moments to talk about code enforcement, because this is the work that is closest to neighborhoods and neighborhood associations. We can use civil laws to address public nuisances. Nuisances are kind of what you can imagine, and I'll have a couple slides that describe that. But essentially, the team that Peter Keith, who's on this call, enforces, they enforce housing, health, safety laws, building, electrical, fire codes, etc. Typically, these are conditions that are attached to a property. So generally, the work of this team, when we know that there's a particular property in a neighborhood where things are not proceeding as they should, we can see if there is a local or state law that's being violated and consider bringing an action to force a property owner to either bring a building up to code or to eliminate a nuisance in a neighborhood. So here are a couple of examples. Next slide. Illegal construction, disrepair or neglect of a property, abandoned vacant properties, hoarding and cluttering. Unauthorized short-term rentals. If it turns out that you know in a neighborhood that there's a property where you think there might be violations of the laws that we have on the books that I helped to author some years back, we can enforce the city law in that area. If there's affordable housing fraud, those laws that are being violated, also we enforce that. If there's an illegal nightclub, if there is an illegal auto repair shop in your neighborhood, if there's a liquor store or a smoke shop that's creating a nuisance, or if there's a property where there's not only known drug dealing, there's drug manufacturing. We don't prosecute individuals for crimes. That is Chesa Boudin's office. But what we can do is we can hold a property owner accountable for, say, criminal activity that might be regularly being committed in it. Next slide. So how do we work together? If you have questions, concerns, suggestions around affirmative litigation, the email address is there. If you have code enforcement issues, there is a code enforcement hotline. I will also mention that Peter Keith's team has assigned a deputy city attorney to every police station and police district in the city. So wherever your neighborhood association is, we have a DCA who is responsible for addressing nuisances in those areas. I mentioned the Controller's whistleblower program, but also just reiterate the obvious, which is if there's an emergency, a crime in progress, a medical emergency, call 911. If there are everyday problems, trash, graffiti, potholes, etc., call 311. But if things are a little more complicated, that's typically when folks will throw up the bat signal and ask our teams to come in. Oftentimes, if there's an issue in your neighborhood, and it could be a planning issue or a DBI issue or a fire department issue, our code team will convene staff from a number of agencies to come in, essentially as a SWAT team, to figure out whether codes are being violated that impact a particular department. So just think about that as a possibility if that situation arises. So with that, I think that's the end of the presentation. Love to turn it back over to you all for any questions you may have. And maybe Michelle, okay, just go back to the Hollywood Squares. Perfect. Right. All right.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much, David. I really appreciate your presentation. And before we get to questions from the audience, there are one or two questions that were given in advance. Eileen Boken, are you on? Can you ask your question?
Yes, Charles, I am. City Attorney Chiu, thank you very much. I did submit a question. We could discuss this offline because it is kind of technical about DCA or former DCA Roddy, who recently retired, that he was the one who did the legal work to transition the AWAS system from the fire department to the PUC, and the possibility, if he could come back on a contract basis, to move it from the PUC to a new department under the city administrator. And so I'd be happy to discuss this offline since it is fairly specific.
Yeah, I actually, Michelle had forwarded that question to me, and just at a high level, the auxiliary water system, which you're referring to, is, I think for folks who know on the west side, basically the system by which we get water to help combat fires all over the city. And the system was in dire need of repairs after, I think it was about 100 years of not being rebuilt. And when I was the board president, I actually authored and championed the two bond measures, the two bond measures, I believe in 2010 and 2014, that created the bond money to continue to do that work. And then after I left the board, my understanding is where the work was being done was transferred departments from fire over to, I think, SFPUC. And yes, our former deputy, John Roddy, who is a longtime expert on water issues, my understanding is he did draft the provisions. But what I will say, Eileen, is the decision, I think your question is, could you move it back or move it under the city administrator's office administratively? And, technically anything could happen. That decision would be made by the policymakers. And I'll sort of answer the question this way. We are lawyers, so we work with clients who make the ultimate decision. So it wasn't exactly John Roddy's decision to move that agency over. He was the person that made sure that from a legal standpoint, it was done properly. If such a change would happen, I suspect it would be a conversation between the SFPUC, probably Dennis Herrera, the fire chief, the mayor, and Carmen Chiu as our city administrator. I will say, I know that at this moment, I think your desire is to move this function under the city administrator. She has had, there's so many functions under the city administrator, frankly, well beyond what is typical, that I suspect she would probably, and I don't want to put words in her mouth, but she would probably say she's just up to her eyeballs with a million things that she's responsible for. So this major project is significant. But you would have to discuss it with her. If the policymakers choose that they want to move it, that certainly would be when, or we would be involved in that conversation and would be involved in making sure that that happens legally and appropriately.
Okay, thank you, David. There was another question I think that you had mentioned to me, Eileen, if you're still there. Do you remember what that one was?
There was just the one.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, before we go to a screenshot of everybody raising their hands, and I would ask Rick and Glenn to help me spot people that want to ask questions. We have to remember a couple of things. Number one, we go with the members of CSFN first before we go to guests. Number two, we ask questions that are basically informational. We don't want a dear sir, you cur kind of thing, which we unfortunately have had in the far distant past, but not recently. So that being said, bless you, Chris. Okay, let's go to the first person that I can see or one of my helpers can see raising their hand.
George.
George or Dave?
I'm sorry? Mary Harris, was that
George has his
you?
hand up and Dave has his hand up.
I don't see.
Okay, George.
Hey, George.
Yeah, hi, David. How are you?
Good.
Good. Basically a statement, and then a question. I think Gus Bear should get a promotion for what he had to put up with this redistricting. And here's my question.
By the way, George, I would agree with you, although I think Gus, we have 3 deputies on the team that is advising the redistricting process. It's headed up by Andrew Shen. We also have Anna Flores. And the 3 of them have basically not gotten. So I would agree with that.
Well, I had to
Mute
see
yourself.
him explain the Voters' Rights Act to the chair of redistricting, so, which was a very hard job, and I couldn't believe it. But moving on, I have never quite understood why Controller Ben Rosenfeld has oversight over the city whistleblowers, and how you're through process, your department works with Ben. So could you please explain why he has oversight over whistleblowers, and then how you guys work together on this?
Absolutely. And by the way, I think I think it went away. There was sound like there was a microphone on. So Ben Rosenfield, our controller, is, as I think everybody knows, is an independent office that is ensuring both the financial integrity of our government, as well as they do a lot of work in a lot of areas to ensure accountability, to ensure efficiency, to ensure good government and effectiveness. I can't tell you, I don't know off the top of my head why the whistleblower program was put under Mr. Rosenfield's shop, except to share with you that at City Hall, everyone from the mayor to the Board of Supervisors, I think no one has ever questioned that that's where it should be. That being said, so our office, we do work closely with the controller's office, particularly around public integrity investigations. You may have seen the vast majority of recent public integrity investigations have been the joint product of my city attorney's office, and specifically the public integrity and investigation team, working with Ben Rosenfield's staff. So for example, a week and a half ago came the report around what was happening at the Department on the Environment. And that was very much a report done in close coordination between our 2 offices. We bring investigatory and sort of a legal analysis. Ben's shop looks at the financial side of things and sort of some of the policy making good government practices. So I would submit that our 2 offices, bring 2 halves of the whole to make sure that good government is emphasized here. But if your question is why is it there, I historically do not know, and now I'm curious, and I'll have to ask Ben.
No, I always thought it would be turned around, the opposite. You would have it over on your oversight, and then you would be asking Ben for a report. But so I've always had that question, but anyhow, thank you.
Of course.
Okay. Dave, you have.
Hi, thank you. I noticed there's a comment in chat asking for Ms. Kong's contact info, and I'd like Mr. Keith's contact info, please.
Absolutely. Happy to do that. And Peter, while you're at it, if it's easy for you to cut and paste the DCAs in each of the police stations, just if it's easy, just throw it out there so people know where your teams are assigned. But yeah.
Okay, I'll try to do that. It's I'm on my remote desktop. There's a challenge. Oh, great. If Michelle has it, yeah.
Great.
Okay, I'll put my own email in the contact as well.
Was that your question, Dave? Great. Any other questions? If not, I can let you guys go
Claire
back.
has a question. Forgive me.
I do.
Hi, Claire.
Go ahead. Hi. David, and congratulations. We're really thrilled that you are a city attorney these days.
Thank you.
My question is, mostly when ballot items get submitted,
Okay, that's David.
the city attorney approves those things, especially like charter amendments, as to form.
We have time for questions.
Thank you, Charles. I think I'm asking my question. My question is, are you ever in a position where you are being asked to provide other language or other recommendations beyond that limitation as to form?
Right. So if I answer your question, we in general, what as to form means is if we're asked by a policymaker, let's say a supervisor, the mayor, a city department, a department head, etc., to propose an ordinance or a ballot measure, we write it as best we can, as long as we think it is legally defensible. We would not approve as to form something that was blatantly unconstitutional. So for example, at least in our town, if someone asked me to write a law that says that abortions are illegal, we just wouldn't approve that as to form. But if there is a real legal argument that something ought to be, even if it is not necessarily 100% certain what the legal outcome might be, we draft it to the best of our abilities, and we sign it as approved as to form. Now, there was another part of your question as to our role when it comes to ballot measures. Our office reviews proposed ballot measures, and we are responsible for approving so-called title and summary, or put another way, what the short description is of a ballot measure, and then the paragraphs that are in the ballot handbook. We're responsible for effectively the first major draft of title and summary, and then it goes to the so-called ballot simplification committee, where the various parties, stakeholders in a ballot fight can basically suggest amendments or edits to title and summary, and it is up to the ballot simplification committee, I think there are 5 members on that committee, who ultimately wordsmith the draft that we have provided to it. So put another way, we're responsible for that first major draft, but ultimately the BSC approves it, and that's what you read in the ballot handbook. Does that answer your question?
Yes, that does, and I really appreciate it. That's very extensive. Thank you so much.
Of course.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you, David. Are there any other questions from anybody present? And
I have a question, Charles.
yes,
I wanted to ask the Department of Building and Inspections seems to be having some trouble with how they run their business. Is there, are you involved in taking care of that particular problem, or is that Chase Bodine's purview?
Well, I think what I can tell you is we discovered a lot of significant issues within DBI, and that investigation is in part what led to the resignation of former director Tom Huey, in part led to the arrests of permit expediters and individuals in and around the Department of Building Inspection. So the work of our investigation team uncovered an awful lot of issues. And I'll also say this, so 7 or 8 years ago, when I was on the Board of Supervisors, I had heard through the grapevine that there were issues within DBI. And so had my predecessor, Dennis Herrera, the then city attorney. And the two of us, we actually teamed up and proposed a major set of ethics reforms to address lobbyists, major developers, as well as permit expediters in and around DBI. And I would say the following, which is not everybody agreed with us. The legislation was amended, some might say, including myself, a bit watered down. We put some rules in place in 2013, 2014, but then a couple years later, Dennis Herrera and the investigation team uncovered all of the issues that I mentioned. So things have been very challenged over there. And in fact, just a couple months ago, I put out a report that laid out the continuation of issues within DBI. I'm happy to, I'm going to try to find that report so I can throw it into the chat for you to take a look at.
Hopefully.
But it continued to lay out significant issues. What I can, there are two portions to the report. One portion, there was the current head of DBI who came in after Tom Huey resigned under a cloud of questions. We were asked if the issues implicated the current DBI head, Patrick O'Riordan. And what our investigators concluded was we did not think that that the issues that were uncovered touched him. But in the second half of the report, it lays out in pretty excruciating detail all of the other things we found about issues within DBI from a few years ago, and there were many. So I will throw that in for you guys to take a look, and you can see really from the chapter headings, the major chapter heading, ample evidence existed of a culture of political favoritism at the time, supported by DBI's then leadership, and an unethical tone at the top. That is what that's a main thesis in the report. And as you can imagine, it was there's a lot there. So I just threw it into the chat.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Glenn. David, before we let you go, I have one quick question, hopefully quick, to ask you. Earlier, before you started, we were given a quick update as much as possible on the redistricting task force, where they have been, where they may be headed. If I can just ask your opinion, best case scenario, what's going to happen?
What I'm trying to find right now, I put out a public memo this morning at 9 o'clock laying out sort of next steps for the redistricting process, because there has been so much confusion on it. And maybe just taking a step back, our office, the team of 3 ethics attorneys that I mentioned, they are advising 3 parties that have been very involved in the discussion: the Board of Supervisors, the redistricting task force itself, as well as the ethics commission, the elections commission. And each of them have had a little bit of a different role sort of in this conversation. But the quick of it is, because we missed the April 15th deadline last week,
Right.
we opened ourselves up to the possibility of a lawsuit, which was filed today. So our office will be handling the defense of that suit. What we've advised the redistricting task force at this moment is we told them, maybe I'll take another step back, which is we told them months ago that they needed to start earlier with their line drawing. We said it over and over and over again, because we anticipated that if they didn't start earlier, they were going to end up in these, what I think it was Chris Bowman who referred to the 15, 20-hour marathon meetings, which are not only have been incredibly painful for the public, but incredibly taxing for the members of the task force. That being said, we are where we are. What we've advised the task force is they have to be done by May the 2nd. And that May the 2nd, it's not statutory. It is what John Arndt, the head of the elections department, has told us. If he does not get a map by that date, he will not be able to prepare for the November elections. Or put another way, we are literally going to jeopardize the November supervisory elections. And so, working backwards from that May 2nd date, there's a requirement of effectively 3 meetings with all sorts of appropriate notice channels. By the way, Peter, while I'm explaining this, are you able to find that public memo?
Yeah, I'll look around for it.
See if you can find it. It's certainly floating around there. I suspect, actually, I bet if you just Google the news articles on it, you'll probably find a link to where it might live. But in order to have the 3 notice meetings before May 2nd, The Thursday meeting is when the task force absolutely has to make a decision on a map. And I suspect if they can't figure it out, the case to go to a judge, this could literally get thrown to the courts for a judge to figure out the map. If the task force can't do it, that possibility exists. So we have advised the task force, but we've put it in a public memo so everybody knows what's at stake and how important it is that that we get this done. The memo also lays out some of the details around what I just described, as well as basically says that any of the maps that were considered, and I want to make sure I get there's some specific wording about this, but there's not just one map that can be considered. There are a number of proposed maps that were considered at different times by the task force, and the task force can consider permutations of a number of the maps that were considered. That's a possibility, but at this point, as we know, it's been a very difficult process. Now, I will also just take a step back and say part of the reason this is so difficult is the exercise itself is very difficult because we've had significant population growth in a number of districts. For example, District 6 and I believe District 10. Those districts had to, under law, shed populations. So the trick is, how do you do this in a way that hopefully keeps certain communities of concern intact, communities of interest intact? So that's the big picture, but it has been a roller coaster of a process.
And I was able to drop that memo, the link to the memo in the chat, David.
Great. This was the work of that team last night.
Thank you very much, David.
Sorry, I think someone spoke, but cut out.
Okay.
We're not hearing you, Charles.
I wanted to ask about the suspected Brown Act violations.
Great.
What happens with those? I mean, they went to move their cars, they were gone forever, they came back, they changed their vote without explanation. I mean, everybody suspects that there was a lot of talking going on. When I thought about the Brown Act, you couldn't even talk in the elevator.
Yep.
You know, so what happens with that?
So as you can imagine, our deputies, part of what we advise all our clients are obligations under the Brown Act, under Sunshine Ordinance, under all sorts of ethics rules. And it is up to our clients to meet those requirements. I can't, I truly can't tell you what happened at certain critical moments where I know the public has a lot of questions, right? I haven't necessarily seen sort of hard evidence of Brown Act violations. I would just say to the public, if there are evidence of wrongdoing, certainly between the Ethics Commission, my office, the Controller's office, we are happy to hear about that. I also know that that because the meeting went so long, 15, 18, 20 hours, it was an incredibly exhausting and grueling process for task force members. And I do think that human error can occur at 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, where people didn't hear something, people misheard something. I know that the room was very loud, so it wasn't possible to hear things. There was confusion about what people were voting on. So I think it's very possible that there was just human confusion in this. What those of us who want to make sure that the laws are upheld is just, to the public, let us know if there is real evidence of wrongdoing, and obviously people will look into that.
Okay, thank you very much again, David. David, I'm sorry, can you hear me?
I can hear you. It looks like George has one last question.
Well,
Okay, very quickly, George.
yeah, very quickly. Thank you, David. It's just too good an opportunity. Was it hard for you to step down from 17? And that's my first question, because I was always so curious about that. And now you have a little bit of election jeopardy coming ahead, which I think you'll overcome. But I was just curious what's going on in your mind.
Well, first of all, I hope not too much election jeopardy, but putting that aside. So listen, it was the honor of a lifetime to represent Eastern San Francisco in the state legislature. And there really is nothing like the legislature. It is an incredible institution. And the 7 years that I spent there, we were able to author, I think, 76 laws on a whole variety of challenging topics. And it was incredibly personally gratifying, but also I felt like I was able to really represent San Francisco in the fights that we led on a whole variety of fronts for tenants, for civil rights, for the environment, for transit, and that was great. I'll say bluntly, we have this thing called term limits, and so while I was not at the end of the term, I knew at some point that job would end. I will also say, just personally, as someone who has a 6-year-old at home and a wife who I want to stay married to for the rest of our natural lives, it wasn't the easiest thing for me to be in Sacramento Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, both the commute, but also just the time away from family. Those of you who have raised little kids, that you can never get that time back in raising my son, who is now in kindergarten. And so, that was a personal factor in this. But I also say, the opportunity to come back to San Francisco, I missed San Francisco in Sacramento, right? Like we live in a great city. And while it was amazing to spend 4 days of the week up in Sacramento, kind of negotiating and haggling and advocating for San Francisco, to actually be back in the city, to be back in City Hall is great. And in this new role, what I love about this new role is I get to, our deputies are involved in every possible matter of interest. Whenever there's controversy, whenever there's something hard, whenever there's something challenging, we're kind of in the midst of trying to solve problems. And that's amazing. And then also the opportunity to not just defend the city against bad lawsuits when Donald Trump tries to challenge our sanctuary city status, or I could give examples of lawsuits that we defend that are righteous, but also many examples of lawsuits that we litigate that are righteous. As I mentioned before, we're taking on polluters, we're taking on the opioid industry, we're taking on companies that are doing bad things. A few months ago, we started an investigation against a whole slew of fly-by-night COVID testing companies that literally set up shop in your neighborhoods, collecting your DNA and your private information, and then just disappearing. And we started that investigation, and that activity disappeared. There was a situation in the Bayview where several construction companies were emitting industrial dust. And I called Peter Keith and I said, what can we do about it? And within a couple of weeks, we issued cease and desist orders, and that has stopped. So there's so much that this office can do. And it's probably not a secret. Like, this office is one of the best public law offices in the country, and to be able to manage it and lead it is an incredible honor. So it wasn't the hardest decision to decide to come home for all those reasons, but whether it's Matt Haney or David Campos elected in a half an hour, they will have a great opportunity